Good morning, good afternoon. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to our webinar session. Today, the topic of this webinar is how to ensure quality survey results and create compelling reports. We are really excited to have you here with us today. My name is Natasha Safronova. I am head of product marketing at SoGoSurvey, and I am very excited to introduce today's webinar host, who will be taking the conversation and leading the conversation and sharing their knowledge with us today. Let me introduce Melissa Kratz. She is VP of Success here at SoGoSurvey. Melissa, in her current role, works with our partners, with our clients, helping to leverage SoGoSurvey platform to drive customer and employee feedback and inform those data-driven and successful business decisions. Hello, Melissa.
What a pleasure to be here with you, and happy to see so many familiar names on the list today. Welcome.
Welcome. And our Ross Rubin, he is a principal analyst at the Radical Research, also the founder of the company, and additionally he's a columnist for ZDNet and for Fast Company. And in his research and his analysis, Ross's focus has been on innovation in technology space and media in telecom. And we are really excited to have you here with us today. Hello, Ross.
Hi, Natasha. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be presenting with you and Melissa again.
Fantastic. All right. So what are we going to talk today about? As we said, the topic is how to ensure those quality survey results and create compelling reports. So a few of the takeaways that we are hoping everybody will be able to get from today's session. You could see on the screen the benefits of designing with the end results in mind. Also, how to optimize survey design to achieve those relevant results. And finally, how to master the art of storytelling with data. But before we get started, let's make sure that we just go over a few housekeeping details to make sure everybody has the best webinar experience possible today. As you may have already noticed, when you join, everybody is muted, but we do want to encourage you to participate in this conversation by leaving on the bottom of your screen. There is chat widget, there is Q&A widget. Please send us your comments, your questions. I would be able to take them as we go through the webinar, but also we are going to have a dedicated Q&A time at the end of the webinar, so we could bring up those questions and facilitate the discussion. And with that, we would like to get started with a quick poll question here, actually to all of you. So let me bring it up on your screens. You should be able to see it now. So just a question to you. Would you rather, one of my favorite types of questions. So would you rather review raw data and create your own report? Would you rather push a magical button that builds that perfect report for you every time? Or would you rather just have somebody else to deal with the whole reporting thing with you? This is, as you could guess, single choice question. I'm really interested what those results would be. And as the moderator, I actually have the sneak peek. So, I see there is a trend. Just a few more seconds and I'm going to bring the results here on the screen for everybody else to see. We have really high participation rates. So I guess something is right with this question. All right, so I'm ending the poll now. And share results. Here we go. So Melissa, what do you think?
What a shocking surprise, Natasha. We've talked about this and clearly, like you said, we've got the right question. We've also got the right audience for it. So interesting. Have somebody else deal with the whole thing. I'm not too surprised that that one's low because we all are in here because we have specific requirements and who knows what that other person is going to come back with. It might not be what you've had in mind. So a little bit of control, but that first one, that raw data, like, oh, I have to do it myself. Oh, I do want control, maybe not that much. That magical button, I agree. That's obviously the correct answer of this opinion question too. Ross, are you shocked by any of those results there?
I'm not, although, I once tried purchasing the magic button. It was defective and it just filled my report with kids coloring book graphics. So I had to return it. Unfortunately, I guess it doesn't really exist yet. So we'll have to help our attendees work around that product gap in the marketplace.
It is, yeah, it's clearly a gap. It might be out of our budget range as well, too, those of us once it's out there. So I think there's a lot of parameters that push us into the fact of like, okay, let's think for ourselves a little bit until that magic button gets invented. But yeah, totally appropriate. So yeah, very welcome. Like I said, no surprises on that question. It's pretty on point for, I hope, many of the reasons that you are all joining us today. And so getting us started, I really wanted to just touch on, we talk about this all the time, that there are many phases of the design process. And if we can take a look at the next slide, you'll recall that when last Ross and I spoke with Natasha on this in this series, so part one of this two-part series, we were talking about a little bit earlier steps in this process. So I just want to be very clear that we will not be able to cover every single phase of this design process today. So really wanted to reiterate that, of course, there's many more steps. Of course, starting with the report in mind, you still have to start before we get to the report. So today we're really focusing on those sort of light blue highlighted pieces, though, their analysis of that data. So we're making assumptions that you've already gotten to that point. You've made some decisions along the way, and now you're ready to think about, what do I do with it? And how do I string all of that stuff together into a gorgeous, fabulous looking deliverable for yourself or a different audience as well. So we could, like I said, we could go on at length about these topics, but for our purposes, we've had to narrow the scope just a little bit. We've only got an hour today, so definitely more to be said here. So when we talk about this phrase, start with the report in mind, start with the end in mind, whatever this looks like. It seems a little bit funny because it's probably the best advice that you can give people. It's the best advice that you can consider for yourself, but it can be a little bit overwhelming to think about what that actual report should look like when you haven't even started asking the questions. So what I would always recommend is starting to identify the goal of your project in the first place. Why are you even doing this? So the most common reasons up here are at the top. Maybe there's some decision that needs to be made. This is business decision with your customers, your employees, and your broader community. Depending on your audience, there's some information that you need in order to be able to move forward. So you're reaching out to connect with them. Testing a hypothesis is a really good one. When you think about the world of marketing, especially, we think this is going to be a good message. We think this is going to be a valuable campaign, but how does it test with our ideal audience? Maybe we're uncovering new information. That's often something that happens early in a project. You can't drill too far deep down one path if you're not really sure where to begin in the first place. So it's a great place to start. Benchmarking is a common one as well too. We always do this, and so we want to be able to track, are we improving? Things are getting better, things are getting worse. But I cannot make this list complete without including the ones down here at the bottom. So if this happens to you, it's not unreasonable. It's something that does happen. Why are you doing this project? We say, and you say, because someone told me I had to. Or the other one is maintaining inertia, because we always do this project every February, for example. So just because that is how it is. That's how we always use this report structure, because that's how my predecessor in this role set it up, or we've done it for the history of the company. This last one, just for something to do, probably said no one ever, right? It's not just to keep busy. It can be a significant project to undertake to do a valuable, valid, meaningful, helpful research project. It takes some work. So it's pretty unlikely that you just wanted to spend some time looking busy. It's pretty likely, though, that those pieces up at the top are the most common use cases. And it's really important because when we start to design that project, when we say start with the report in mind, all of the content that we include in that survey needs to drive that goal, needs to be relevant here. So put together a very sophisticated model for you on the next slide, which I'm referring to as the Mad Libs diagram. So when you start to think about that decision-making process of what belongs in your survey and what doesn't, you're thinking about what belongs in the report as well. So those of you who have our written a research paper, for example, you know that thesis is the most important piece. The rest of the stuff, if it doesn't relate to the thesis, it's not trying to prove your point, it doesn't belong in your paper. Maybe it's a different chapter, a different article, for example. The same is absolutely true. My background is in writing, so I spend a lot of time looking at things from the writing lens, but maybe your background is in science, so you like the hypothesis lens as well. My guess, meaning I have some information, is that this is the answer is this question, or the decision should be this. What that means is all of the relevant data, in order to be able to complete that statement, needs to be included in your survey, right? So if your decision or your guess is based on, my guess is that people who attend this webinar are very likely to choose magic button, please, right? No kidding, because I know the audience. I know that they've self-selected to attend this session as well, but I could also collect some additional data up front. Oh, these are people who are already conducting their own research projects. These are people who have already completed projects in the past, have some experience. So the more data that you have, based on role name, for example, or based on industry, the more information that you need to know in that report. Again, it could be the actual question. Here, the decision-based, for example, is it perception that's important to you? Oh, a lot of people like this, or a lot of people don't like this. Is that useful for you? Or is it based on actual facts, like statistics? How frequently do people visit a certain location? So that raw number, when we see that sort of reported data versus that sort of perception data, there's a role for each of those, depending on the kind of feedback. So if you come back to that audience, you're thinking about the last one down here, there are some audiences who do not want to hear, we should do this because it will make a lot of people happy. Right? So happiness, Natasha mentioned, yeah, success is one of my big goals as well too, but success is measured in many different ways by many different audiences. So really thinking about that idea of who is your audience. If it's just you, fine, that's helpful. There's nothing wrong with it being a report just for you as an audience, but thinking about those perhaps several audiences that you're going to need to connect with. Maybe this one is for a certain department or a certain location or a certain management level. Maybe there's less information as you go a little bit higher up the range. Some people want to see an appendix, some people don't. If you can complete this statement that you've started with at the beginning, I will share answer to this question with the senior leadership team at our annual retreat this summer, and they can't wait to find out XYZ, like the magical secret to employee satisfaction, for example, whatever those pieces are. So having that frame, whichever method you look, use the goal that you have in mind to drive the content, to drive the design, because when you come to the report, when you're looking at those raw results, you'll know you have all of the ingredients to be able to put together. A lot to say.
I would just, a
Please.
quick comment, Melissa, bringing together the last slide and this slide. Very often when when we talk about this topic of inertia, that shouldn't be confused with the value of tracking studies, which are repeated every year, every quarter, however often the frequency demands. I would argue that in tracking studies where you're looking at many of the same measures and parameters repeated over perhaps a long period of time, some of that work around what is the goal of this study has been established way back when the survey was created. And every time you field that study again, you face the question of what in this study is it important that we continue to pursue because we really want to continue that trend data versus what kinds of things may there be less value in tracking. Maybe we can get rid of some of those questions because there are more valuable things to ask about these days that we know we're going to want to track over time because we believe they're going to be significant for the future when it comes back to again think about that report in mind. Maybe not only this year's report, but maybe next year's report. So a great example would be in, say, an employee satisfaction survey. If you had been doing that for the past 5 years, last year probably would have been a good year to start asking more about hybrid work and working from home to a much broader audience, because clearly that is going to be an issue that many companies are going to be needing to track for the foreseeable future. So.
Agree. So you mean the repetition doesn't mean value, right? Just repetition for the sake of it?
Not for the sake of it. No.
Good. Agree. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for sharing that point too. So let's talk a little bit about, now we get it. The structure, the setup is really important, but I've also mentioned, and we've talked a little bit about results versus reports. So I want to get into that a little bit here. So on the next slide, we have a very sophisticated diagram that references how many of us often perceive what happens in this sort of broad scheme. There's a bunch of stuff, question mark in the middle, and then ta-da happens at the end. So to just give a caption to each of these on the next slide, we have results. We're talking about the raw stuff, the data, the bits that all come together. So we're talking about the statistics, we're talking about graphs and tables, the takeaways, the raw results here we're talking about. We'll come back to this question mark in the middle here momentarily, but the difference here at that end, that final product that you've heard about, say deliverable, like if it's for you, it's still a deliverable, it's a final ta-da packaged product kind of thing at the end. So this idea of, I see, my lights go off here. I see what's happening here. It's inspirational, apparently. That idea that all of the information comes together in that final product, that's really what we're looking for in the takeaway here. So there's nothing wrong with results, I should say up front. So let's just say results are important. Results definitely in terms of that idea of the raw data. And there's probably a reason that this is blue. Those of you who use a specific report in our platform, you probably know which report I'm talking about here. The blue report, also known as the Omni report, gives us such useful information all the time. It is a delightful, amazing report that gives us lots of raw data, but it is not all the end all be all report as well, in that it can be just a starting point for you as well. So when we're talking about that idea, and Ross mentioned here the employee satisfaction survey, exactly. When we do conduct that employee satisfaction survey, we come away with a bunch of nuggets, a bunch of raw data here. So we might say, guess what? There was participation. Lots of people in this particular office participated. Good information? Sure, of course. But it also asks the question, well, what other locations are there? Was it high or low relative to those other locations? We don't know just based on this one fact. 55% chose strongly agree in response to I want more feedback. Good information? Maybe, but also think about the trend idea too. Is that up or is that down? And that's only one answer option, perhaps on a 4 or 5 point scale. If 45% of people said strongly disagree, that gives us a full picture versus all the rest of those people also said agree. So combining some of those answer options may be more valuable than just the raw data point by itself. And possibly a realistic scenario here, but this last one, 2 people want marshmallows in their instant cocoa. Again, very specific information, perhaps very actionable, but perhaps not helpful in the broader scheme. 99% of people said, we have cocoa? So the idea, I sometimes refer to this in employee engagement discussions as the squeaky chair. For one person, that makes a huge difference, but for a lot of other people, they've never noticed, right? And so even though that's useful information, it's most useful when it's actionable. And I think that's an important piece to think about. Your results don't necessarily have to be your report. Your results aren't necessarily what a tool, even an amazing software solution, delivered for you automatically. There are some points in between the raw results and the fabulous report. I shouldn't go on too much about this because this is not the whole point, but keep in mind, good results do inspire the rest of the project as well too. Ross, anything to add on this one? You feel okay about results?
Yeah, no, just, sometimes, just to your earlier point, Melissa, I think a lot of it is going to come down to the audience. You have to think about the level of detail. I really liked your point on the second bullet. There's a big difference between saying 55% strongly agreed and another 40% somewhat agreed versus saying 55% agreed and the other 45% strongly agreed. So how you make those cuts, even if you're not doing a lot of sophisticated crosstabs or filtering or things like that, really comes down to the kind of picture you're looking to paint, and whether you're endeavoring to present as reflective a view of reality as you can get out of the report, or whether you have some agenda. And I'm not here to judge, either of those options, but we do see both of them. So.
Yeah, I agree. I like the painting metaphor there. Sometimes people just paint by number, right? And that's the raw results here. Here's the number, check. So if you take a look at that next slide there, we're trying to inform the miracle. Yes, we all want that magical button. We all just want to wake up the next day and everything is together, but it requires decisions to be made. It's just like, oh, but also those of you who said, I don't want someone else to create that report for me. It's your role, it's your hand in it. So we have that idea when we consult with our clients as well too. It's like, look, I can tell you how the technology works. I can tell you what makes sense to me, but it's really what makes sense to you. So does it make sense to combine strongly agree and agree? Maybe you do want to see those differentiated because you want to see how passionate certain people feel, but maybe you want to see that sort of broader picture at a glance. Are more people happy or more people unhappy? That's a good way to look at it as well too. Questions and answers to include. Some of those questions, some of those pieces that you include in your survey are really more like those demographic questions, sort of those breakdown questions that you really want to just use for segmentation or for filtering. They don't necessarily have to be reported on. So for example, that example of location, maybe it is important to know what % of people participated at each location. Maybe you'll be able to see, wow, or a certain department was almost overrepresented here. Possible. But maybe it's not really important because all you care about is the satisfaction breakdown, one department beside the other. And it's a totally different kind of comparison. And I think it's also important to note here that there are multiple ways to look at the same piece of data, right? If you're saying employee satisfaction, for example, maybe you look at this by location, maybe you look at this by tenure, maybe you look at this by department, for example. All of those things are really important depending on your audience. Some people are getting through that part. There are people who like skip the first page of a book because they're like, yeah, let's get to some action. It's the same thing that happens sometimes when you're looking at a survey. We build surveys in that conversational tone where we say, welcome. Here are some polite questions to ask you, but sort of warm you up to have the deeper conversation. And so the reports, in many cases, we just want to start with the meaningful conversation and use those preliminary questions to help us break down all the rest of the pieces as we go along. So those decisions on the left-hand side, but also the technical pieces on the right-hand side as well. How does your audience best understand or best process that information? We have people who really, really like pie charts. There's nothing wrong with a pie chart, right? It's very useful. It's very clear. It makes people, it's easy for people to understand as well too. But there are also those decision points as well. Like, do you really have people who want to see tables? Do you have people who prefer 1 or 2 decimal points? Filtering and segmentation are 2 different things. Segment is I want to see those pieces side by side. Filtering is I just want one slice at a time. Doesn't necessarily have to be on the same report, and keeping in mind that you might be making different decisions for different deliverables ultimately. I could go on and on this one, but I know that this is a lot of where we're going to come back to here with Ross. So I'll just reiterate this on the next slide. Magically, all this stuff comes together and we have this glorious finished product. And by product here, report or reports, maybe it's slide decks, maybe it's some people really just like Excel, like, okay, I'm not here to judge you about your formatting preferences as well. Some people want to see the whole story written out. But to wrap up this section here, 2 different metaphors, depending on what kind of audience you are. If you are feeling a little hungry at this time of the day, the next slide will tell you. You can think of these 2 pieces, reports and results, as the ingredients or the recipe. If you don't have the right ingredients, you're not putting them together in a meaningful way, you're not going to end up with this nice, of course, nice is relative if you like pancakes, which obviously I do, but you're happy with the product. You could definitely take those ingredients and make lots of different recipes. Like it wouldn't just have to be pancakes. It's not an obvious 1 and 2 equals 3 here in this case. There are any number of different things that you could create with that. And I think that's important to know. There's not one perfect result. There's a result that's appropriate for that audience, that goal at that time. The other metaphor, if you're not so food driven at this time, if you prefer, is what happens to us every time we drive slightly off track. We're reminded by our helpful virtual assistants in many cases, who tell us to just get back on the right road, please, if you wouldn't mind. And this is what happens sometimes too, when we're putting together, we're making those decisions that inform what turns a result into a report, into that final product. There's so many different ways to go. And it happens to me, it happens to all of us, where we get distracted, like, oh, over here, there's something interesting, and over here, there's something else. But remember, ultimately, we're trying to go somewhere. We're trying to achieve that goal. And ideally, we're trying to bring our audience along with us. So we have to make decisions. We can't take every turn, right? But also, if we don't know where we're going, we will probably never get there. So I think that's a metaphor of your choice, I would say. Natasha, you had something to mention on this one as well too, I think, right?
Right. I just really have to having my marketing, product marketing hat on. It's like what really resonates with me is keeping that audience in mind who you're creating this report for, because that really will, it's not that the data is like bad sometimes, but report is not resonating. It's just like really understanding who you are speaking to and what they care about, like what kind of information is relevant for them, what kind of questions they might have for you. And that's where it comes really the higher level, the grouping, or like diving deep into the data. So that's probably like my biggest career learning from like as a marketer, like if I'm presenting some kind of results, the outcomes, what to report really should always like keep in mind that one version of report is not enough, because there are different audiences probably you want to talk to.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the last slide up here in this section, which is what we imagine, what we like to have in our survey design. We'll see on that piece here, right? It's the same thing that we have in mind in our own heads. What's the ultimate outcome? If someone says, great job, you gave me exactly the information that I needed, I'm so happy. And you think, oh, thank you, audience or audiences, right? Like, I'll be here all day, this kind of thing. The worst feeling is that you bring a report to someone and they say, where's the breakdown by preferred language? And you say, why didn't you ask me this earlier? Like, there is no breakdown by preferred language because we didn't ask that question. So we also want to have that sort of internal goal in mind too, is like that we provide value to the people, either to ourselves or to other colleagues on our teams as well, to say like, great job, this was useful. And to Ross's earlier point about that benchmarking and trends, like this is useful information and it will continue to be useful information for us to check in on. Like, even this is just the baseline. This is the first time we've done it. Nice job setting a solid baseline that we can operate from in the future. All right, Ross, why don't you bring it all together? We've seen all the different metaphors. We've got all the winding roads. Take us home, I should say.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I just one last comment on that discussion, which is a lot of the issues that Melissa brings up around this idea of figuring out what questions to ask early on regarding preferred language or any other kinds of breakdowns you may want to see in the report. We discussed a fair amount of that in the last webinar that we did together. So I'm guessing that's somewhere on the SoGoSurvey website. And we talked a lot about scope in that presentation, as well as bringing together stakeholders and how important that is. So, again,
there
thank
absolutely
you.
is. Sorry, Ross, just to add, since you
Sure,
touched on
sure.
it, yes, if somebody missed that first webinar and is willing to listen to that part of a story, it could be found on SoGoSurvey website under the resources and webinars. It's all there, the recording, the materials. And back to you, Ross.
Wonderful.
But
wonderful.
wait until we're done with the session. Hold on. Wait.
Yeah, don't go yet.
Do it now.
Don't answer yet. Okay. Thanks everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit more about how very often you'll have a set of charts or data that you have created in, say, the reporting module of a tool like SoGoSurvey, and then there is a requirement to bring those into some kind of narrative, and I'm going to use that term somewhat loosely, in that it might be something like a PowerPoint deck, or it might be a more sort of Word like report with a lot of text and paragraphs punctuated by certain charts. I would say increasingly these days it's taking form as video, and that could either be a video of someone narrating what we're seeing in the literally a narrative report, somebody narrating what we're seeing happening in the data, or perhaps even animations on the charts themselves. A lot of exciting things happening with visualization there. But I'm going to focus on really the key findings of a report. Sometimes they take shape as an executive summary, and sometimes for some audiences, for better or worse, it may be about as far as the audience gets in terms of digesting what the value is of the report. So let's go to the next slide. And I do a lot of work in the fairy tale community, and you may be familiar with this real business problem that these three little pigs had. And so it would certainly not be inaccurate if I were doing a research study on what's happening in the pig housing market to have a key finding that notes that 2 out of 3 pig houses are susceptible to wolf breath attacks. If you're familiar with the story, that is absolutely true. And not only that, it is even quantitative. So we've got that good quantitative support for the story there. And yet, if you're familiar with the story, you know that that doesn't really tell, really doesn't capture the spirit and value of the story, right? So we're going to come back to this, and talk about why this is not a very satisfying finding, even though it would be a valid one, given the data that we have. So when you're thinking about how to construct these narratives, there are, Melissa gave a couple of different metaphors. I'm going to also share a couple of ways of thinking about it. One framework that's used very often in the research industry is this idea of what, so what, and now what. So what basically means the results. What are we seeing? What is the data? What is sort of that pool of information that we can draw from? So what means, what are the implications? Okay, there's all of this information out there. Tell me what it means. What is significant? How is it relevant? And you're able to get to a lot of that through things like filtering and crosstabs and a lot of the drilling down that Melissa alluded to. And then there's now what, right? You've told me what the study says. You've told me what's relevant to me. Now tell me, what should I do about it? Because that's really why we were interested in this study. We wanted to know where do we go from here? So that's one way of thinking about it. Another framework that I like to use is the landscape outlook mandate framework. And this was something I actually developed many years ago, working at a research firm that did a lot of early work on the development of the consumer internet. So the landscape section is the descriptive part of the report. And it's kind of a roll-up of the what and the so what, right? Very often, there's not a lot of time to talk about the what. You're going to want to, sort of as we were discussing earlier, because people's attention is limited, kind of jump right to the so what, right? Here's what's significant that we found in the data. Don't tell me everything you found in the data, but let's start off by talking about what is significant. And then we're going to talk about how we think this may continue or not, which is the outlook section of the report, right? So we have the descriptive section, and then we have the predictive section, which is how likely do we think this is going to continue in the future, or will it be disrupted? Are we looking at a trend? Is something going to change? Why might it change? And then, as in the other framework, we have our what should I do about it section, the prescriptive part of the report. So we refer to that as the mandate. So landscape outlook mandate, descriptive, predictive, prescriptive. And one reason why I prefer this system is because I think that it kind of focuses your thinking on developing the highest value that you can, both in the narrative and in the key findings. So don't want to disparage what, so what, now what, very useful. Use the one that resonates for you. But here's an alternative if you think it has value for you. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about in the Outlook section, how do you look into the future? How do you make a statement about what is going to happen, whether what we're seeing, whether what we've seen in the past will continue into the future, or whether something may come to disrupt that? And there are many great tools that you can employ to create a narrative there. There's a lot you can do with forecasting. There's a lot you can do with data science these days. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here today. But I like to think in terms of three main ways of thinking about events and the progression of events. There is precedent, which is essentially, has anything like this ever happened before, right? Because if something is unprecedented, that really means we are in new territory. We talked about our employee satisfaction survey earlier. For all intents and purposes, the COVID pandemic has been unprecedented. I mean, yes, there have been pandemics before. You know, you may sometimes see references to the swine flu outbreak of 1918, but the world was very different back then. It may have precedent from an epidemiological standpoint, but not really in terms of, say, the world of modern work. Then there are patterns, okay? Are we seeing the kinds of things we're seeing in the data happening over and over again? Do they rise and fall at a particular interval? And then there are trends, you know, are things continuing to move in a certain direction? And of course, these are all great ways of thinking about these various tracking studies. Anything that you're tracking on a continuous basis, you're going to have a lot of good data to defend or deny whether any of these things hold true, whether there's precedent, whether we're seeing patterns, or whether we're seeing a trend. And then, as I note, you know, it's not always going to be the case that these things are holding true. And you have to come up with the support as to why you think they will prevail or won't prevail. So beyond that, next slide. I think, you know, one of the things that we often see in, say, press releases about research or sometimes studies, and it is a challenge because, you know, very often when you are sharing news about research, you try to really condense everything down into a headline, and that's very often difficult. So very often we wind up with things that are either overly simplistic or that are cliches. So, you know, something will grow or shrink. This is good or bad, you know, and then a whole host of cliches. Competition will increase. Yes, that is often the case. The right partnerships are essential. The future will be different than it was in the past. I mean, just think about if you find yourself leading with one of these kinds of findings, you may want to ask yourself, when is this not true? Without adding more details. Something will pose unique challenges. Well, all challenges in some way are unique. This must become a priority, right? You're often trying to make the case for something. And the challenge there is that, particularly if you're presenting to, say, some management group or executive group, they have 100 priorities, right? And so the idea is that you can't just say it has to become a priority. You have to say why it is or is not a higher priority than something else they may be considering a priority. Everything is a trade-off, right? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So how do we combat some of these generalities and cliches? Well, one way is by thinking about nuance, making the finding richer, adding more dimension to it. And the Landscape Outlook Mandate Framework can help you raise questions that help address that kind of nuance. When you're talking about landscape type findings, they'll typically address questions like, who or what's happening, or where are we seeing this? The Outlook section will typically address questions such as, when can we expect something to happen? Or why is it happening? Or how much by a certain time? And then the mandate is usually, of course, about how. How do we deal with whatever we're seeing in the marketplace? I talked about the simplification, sometimes oversimplification of something, saying that something is, or phenomenon is growing or shrinking. One way you can enrich that a little bit and add to the value of the finding is to think about key elements to a phenomenon, right? So there'll be something, telecommuting, people vaping, people doing more streaming videos, right? Some behavior or attitude that you're seeing in the data. Yes, you want to talk about the movement of that phenomenon, but you also want to talk about the reaction to that phenomenon, right? So if we're seeing streaming emerge as a very popular phenomenon, as a growing phenomenon, you can take your finding to the next level by not just saying the percentage of consumers subscribing to streaming services rose 34%, over the past year, but you can say that, that came at the expense of going to movies or cable subscriptions, or drawing contrasts that say, video streaming grew much more than audio streaming did, or there's this new generation of game streaming services like Xbox Game Pass or Google Stadia that may have grown even faster. And why did this happen? Well, for one thing, they're starting from a much lower base, right? So that's one reason why they may be growing faster. And so what I would just conclude with on this is that many analyses focus excessively on the movement, which only gives you so many dimensions to play with, right? It can grow, it can shrink, it can stay the same. And there are, there's some quantification to that. How quickly it's growing, is it accelerating or not? But if you describe the implications of the movement, you really have an opportunity to tell a much richer story that provides a deeper, a richer perspective on what we're actually seeing in a marketplace or at a company or among your customers. So next slide. So remember we talked about our three little pigs in the beginning. And so I thought it might be a fun exercise to think about how we might enrich some of those findings with some of the points that we discussed today. So one finding might be that, although no pigs in the brick houses reported destruction due to the wolf breath attacks, 9 out of 10 who are planning to purchase homes in the next 6 months, right? That's a segment that we're going to drill down on because it's most relevant to our client, which is a pig housing company, cited brick housing is too expensive. Okay, so what if it's too resilient? I mean, that's great, but if it's out of your customer's budget, it's a little bit irrelevant, right? Unless you can figure out some way to make brick housing cheaper. In addition, because we wanted to ask not just about the wolf attacks, but really get a richer sense of what's happening in the market, we found that wolf attacks were ranked relatively low compared to, say, forest fires, which increased from being ranked number 3 to number 1 as a concern over the past 2 years, right? Not surprising, given all the unfortunate news about forest fires in the past few years. We also found that a high percentage of pigs had a high interest in taking their existing straw or stick housing and making it more fire resistant, right? How do they want to do that? What are their concerns if something were available to help them do that? Well, we asked them that, we had the foresight to ask them that, and safety and sustainability, again, being on trend, were really cited as key criteria for adoption. So we're going to take all of these, landscape-focused questions. I would argue that, maybe the third bullet is a little bit outlooky or outlookish because we're looking into the future a little bit when we're asking about intent. And our fourth bullet is a mandate type finding, right? We're saying, and how do we know that? Because it includes the words should or must. So Pig Housing Inc. should investigate sources of materials to make less expensive straw and stick housing competitive to brick when it comes to resisting fires. So, this is how the Three Little Pigs fable goes in an alternate multiverse, where there are a lot of research analysts studying the phenomenon. So that I think is our last slide here. And so I will thank you again for attending and throw it back to Natasha.
Thanks, Ross. Yes, so we actually have one more point for discussion here. So poll question is going to be on your screen in just 1 second. Here we go. Hopefully you see it now. The question is, how easy is it to blend credibility with leadership in your reports? Since this is poll question, this is single answer, and we did not do a scale, but is it very easy, somewhat difficult, very difficult? Oh, you don't know, because you have somebody else who takes care of this for you. All is valid. All right. So just a few more seconds here to get those responses. Wow, all right. It looks like we have one trending answer here. A little surprising for me, but we'll see. We'll see what. Okay, I'm going to end the poll here. Oh, answers keep coming. All right. Second attempt to end poll and sharing results. Are you surprised by this results, Ross?
I'm somewhat surprised. I'm not very surprised because sometimes the stars will align, and we didn't really define leadership, so that that may have contributed to it. But when we were thinking about this question, we were thinking more along the lines of leadership as something that is an uncommon finding, something that's very differentiated, something that stands out from, say, the conventional wisdom. And that can be sometimes difficult because there's a lot of momentum, and if you're going to go against the grain, sometimes that can make your credibility seem a bit compromised. Again, this is all perception. I don't necessarily believe that, but sometimes it may be difficult to you may be forced to make a choice and be a contrarian. And sometimes that comes with a challenge to credibility. The team here had a lot of discussion about this over the past few weeks, and we just want to be encouraging you to take those leadership positions, even if you have to scale back a little bit on the credibility to a position that is maybe somewhat less specific. But is nonetheless accurate. If you have to give up a bit of precision in order to offer differentiated value, that is often worth pursuing. And I know that's often a bit of a tangent from everything we've talked about, but maybe that's another webinar.
Yeah. Question of accuracy and validity. Yeah, I think this one is when you think about that audience, like we talked about earlier, that who's like, oh, great job. Sometimes, you have an audience that has a certain expectation too. Like, we just want to be told that what we're doing is working. And so sometimes it can be like, doesn't seem like leadership when you're just like, nuh-uh, that kind of thing. Ideally, yeah, exactly the point here too. It should be credible. It should be, the questions have to be valid. The analysis has to be valid. And when you're going to put those takeaways in front of somebody else, you have to be able to say, yes, I stand behind this. And you don't want people to be like, yeah, we already know that stuff. So sometimes there's a little bit of that safety and versus that like dynamic, innovative leader, which can be a little bit of a scary ledge to stand out on sometimes as well.
I saw a good comment in the chat about, if you've designed the survey clearly and properly, the results should be credible and show leadership position. I would argue that is true for many of the findings. I think where the conflicts typically come up is in that now what or mandate section. What should we do about it? Because there you start to lean more into opinion, frankly. So.
Perfect. Thanks for bringing up that comment. I was about to bring it up too. We also got one question we received, and I just wanted to remind everybody that it's time. If you have additional comments, if you have questions, please use either chat or Q&A widget on the bottom of your screen and send that question to us. We getting some of them, so that's exciting. Before I start, also like getting into the question, just also wanted to kind of like a quick reminder for everyone that the webinar materials would be available for you. They'll come in your email, and then also after this webinar, we are going to have like a quick survey will pop up on your screen, and we kindly ask you to provide us those responses because we also want to understand how did we do, could we improve, and are you interested in any next steps? But that would be after this session concludes. And for now, discussion time. And let's get to our questions. So the first question we received is, how do you discover different factors or parameters that influence a core metric that we are trying to measure?
I'd be happy to start there. I can tell you definitely, we talk a lot about in training sessions, especially in customer experience, we talk a lot about key drivers. Right. So we have that idea of that, like, there are so many different factors that you're measuring. Like, yes, you want to know that overall satisfaction, or yes, you want to know NPS, for example. So you're going to ask that core question, but you're also going to ask a lot of those sort of influencing questions, those other variables that we know have an impact on, let's say, customer experience. Like, is it timeliness of resolution, or is it validity and usefulness of information in this webinar, let's say, for example. All of those different things are sort of our guesses. Those are our hypotheses along the way, that we have a guess that those ideas might have an impact. So when you get into the analysis stage, it's certainly those in that setup, you've got that core metric, you've got those key drivers as well. In the analysis stage is where you're looking to bring those pieces together, to look at that correlation. And we've talked about crosstabs a few times. There are a few other reports. Key driver analysis is the one that comes to mind for me in this one. It's basically a one-click report, I will just say. The idea that, like, you don't have to calculate all of those things yourself. Sometimes you do have a platform that will help you figure out those pieces, because it's not just, oh, the information was timely. Maybe that's got a low rating, or maybe it's got a high rating, but I don't really care about the rating overall. I care about its potential impact on that core metric. So even though this might have a low rating, if it has a low influence on that core metric, it's not where I should put my time and resources. It's really those things that are most influential that I should focus on.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. And like a quick follow-up, I am assuming from the same question, from the same person who asked the question, they're asking if such reports are available in SoGo, saying that they don't see them in their account.
Such delightful reports are available in SoGo. I mean, obviously, it's going to depend on the products that you have here. I'm talking about a CX one specifically, but also, I mean, crosstab you're going to have in a lot of different account types that we have too. The question is, how much of the analysis do you want to do yourself, and how much do you want that magic button that we talked about earlier? So CX for sure.
Perfect. All right. The next question here is, what is the optimal length of survey? Is it 3, 5, 8 questions that will ensure buy-in to the process of completing the survey?
I'm going to let Ross take that one. Go ahead, please.
Oh, what's that I could design? What's that everyone was happy with an 8-question survey? Well, look, certainly a lot of it depends on the medium in which you're going to field it. If it's going to be a pop-up question on, say, a website, an intercept, right? Intercept question, you're probably not going to want to go for more than 2 questions there. But if it's part of, say, a managed panel, and these folks have opted in, and you have a relatively broad area of study, you may need to ask 15, 20 questions. I would say that best practices, you're probably not going to want to go far above 20, 25 questions, although people very, very often do, unfortunately, and guilty as charged, but only because clients want that. So a lot of it, that's why it really comes back to scope, right? Something that we keep talking about, very, very important a very useful tool, very useful way to think about the what you want to ask so that you don't wind up with 50 questions. The other thing you can do is take advantage of great logic tools within the survey development environment to structure your survey so that you're asking the right questions to the right respondents, so that you don't blanket people with irrelevant questions if they don't, something doesn't pertain to them. And then, this way, even though you may have 50 questions, a respondent may not get more than 20 of them, any given respondent. So that's one way of dealing with it.
And I would add just briefly to that point, in addition to logic, asking only relevant questions, the other piece that I would add is pre-population. If you know your audience and you know some information about them, that kind of stuff that we want to be able to use in the slice and dice, like location or role or anything like that. I already know that information about our employees, for example. I can pre-fill that and I save maybe 10 different questions, right? That I can actually ask them the questions that I need their feedback on, not stuff that I already know. It's insulting to ask people, I say this all the time, but like it's insulting to ask people things that you should already know about them, but it also helps to limit the length of the survey itself.
Great. We have two more really good questions here that I want to make sure that we answer. And then probably we'll just take the rest to the, if there are any additional questions that come in, we'll just respond to them offline. But so the next question is, the problem that I encounter that the recipients of my reports don't believe that data has delivered results they don't like. So how do you explain this? I show the raw data, the samples, but that's not enough.
Well, look, unfortunately, we are in an environment where many people choose not to believe things that have been vetted out through various proof points, be it behavioral data or scientific data. And you're, as a researcher or an analyst, there's only going to be so much you can do in order to change people's minds. The one thing one recommendation I would give is that sometimes it's useful, or it may be useful, to have the story come from outside the organization, from a source that the constituency, the audience, may be more likely to believe, because ultimately, if they are not going to take the results seriously, they're wasting their own time in having their internal research groups field a survey if they're not going to listen to the results. So it may be useful depending on how much control you have over the budget and how much flexibility you have for certain types of questions to outsource that kind of research to an independent third party that the group may be more inclined to believe. That's about all I can offer.
100% agree. I mean, we do manage projects here, and we are more likely to do employee projects because of that same third party partiality. But the other thing I would say is, if you're doing it yourself, be transparent about the decisions that were made. Be clear, we're looking at this filtered data. This data was collected during this time. Giving that annotation, you can do it in Omni. You can add a little narrative slide. You can add those notes to the bottom of the slide that say, here's the context as well too. So you give as much information as possible for people to make their own decisions.
All right, and our next and last question that we are going to answer today is, are some types of styles of reports, narrative versus chart versus raw data, more likely to be read or studied by those who should really use the data?
I'm just going to say this magical blend that Ross mentioned earlier is perfect for me, right? Here's a table. Look at these two things, these two or three things side by side that scores in Omni with segmentation, for example, like, well, here's the breakdown for the core question that's most important. And some of that narrative analysis, to me, it's back and forth, a balance.
Yeah, I just say there's a lot you can do with decks or slides in terms of building narratives. You always want to avoid what I sometimes refer to as death by PowerPoint. You don't want to have a 150 slide deck, but maybe some 10 to 15 slides. If you structure the headings of the slides appropriately, if you label things appropriately, that can be very effective in conveying a lot of information. Again, I think it's more of an emerging area, but I would be exploring video more because it's just increasingly the way a lot of people digest information.
Fantastic. All right. So I want to thank everyone for being with us for the entire hour. A few takeaway slides here, and we encourage you to connect with us. On this slide, you could see more information about radical research and Ross. So the link to who is radical research, what they do, and also the radical research report. That there is a free trial subscription over here. You could reach out by email, or you could also, like when you fill out the survey at the end of the webinar, just check that box and we'll make sure to reach out to you. Any additional words here, Ross, that you would like to add to this slide? Perfect.
No, thank you.
All right, and from the SoGo side, we encourage you to take the next step. If you're not our existing client yet, please reach out to us, sign up for that account, and we do have this complimentary survey designed and built by our expert offer. So take us up on that. That's you could see email, phone number on this slide, but we were also going to receive the slides in your email, and so you could you'll be able to click that button actually. But again, at the end of the webinar, just choose if you want us to follow up with you. Gladly connect and provide you a little bit more details on what we offer and what we could do for you. We'd be happy to help. And with that, really, we are again very thankful for you to join in our session. We hope you found it helpful, and here's to better reports ahead.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone.